Fellow at the Maryland Ware Center for Security Studies and has worked on defense issues in the U.S. Congress and in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and on the Joint Staff. She specializes in defense strategy, budget, military readiness, and the defense industrial base. She previously was with the Heritage Foundation. The Honorable Van Hipp, Jr. is Chairman of American Defense International, Inc. From 1986 to 1989, Van Hipp served as the chairman of the South Carolina Republican Party and is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Army. In place of Senator Jim Inhofe, who could not join us this afternoon, is Lucian Niemeyer, a professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee. He's a longtime congressional aide and served in the Air Force. Niemeyer is a veteran of the contentious Base Closure and Realignment Commission of 2005. Christopher Preble is the Vice President for Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. A frequent guest on television and radio, Preble was a commissioned officer in the U.S. Navy and holds a Ph.D. in history from Temple University. And finally, the Honorable Donald Devine is Vice Chairman of the American Conservative Union and the editor of Conservative Battle Line, the publication of the ACU Foundation. Devine has served as a member of the Board of Directors of the ACU for more than 20 years. Please welcome our panel.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. You got to be somewhere. And it's great to be with a bunch of wonderful conservatives. Glad to have you here. My name is Donald Devine. As he said, my claim to fame is I was head of the bureaucracy for Ronald Reagan during his first term when we actually did make some important steps to control the bureaucracy, defense and civilian, and domestic, I should say. I remember when Ronald Reagan gave me a call, he said, "Don, I got a job for you." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Head of the civil service." I said, "Well, what do you want me to do? I'm kind of a libertarian type." And he said, "Well, I want you to cut 100,000 non-defense employees. I want you to cut their bloated benefits, and I want you to make them work harder." I said, "Thanks a lot. Going to make a lot of friends in this job." But I always remember what Harry Truman said: "You need a friend in Washington? Buy a dog." So I bought two to be on the safe side, and actually we did cut 100,000, cut about $16 billion in benefits, and we put in a pay-for-performance system, and they did work harder, at least for a couple of years. Today we're talking about the defense side, and remember, almost half the employees of the federal bureaucracy are in the Department of Defense. We originally were supposed to have Senator Coburn here to debate Senator Inhofe, and Senator Coburn has just published a book which a pamphlet I recommend. It's called Department of Everything, and talks about what the Department of Defense does on the civilian side that isn't defense. He comes up with about $67.3 billion you could save by just having the Department of Defense do defense matters. But you're going to hear from some real experts on defense today, and the first one I'm going to introduce, a good friend of mine, the treasurer of the American Conservative Union Foundation, the head of Defense Systems International, I may have messed that up a little, and a former Defense Department top official, Van Hipp.
Thank you, Don. It's great to be here at CPAC. The readiness of our armed forces is at a tipping point. Budget conditions unfolding right now are causing this readiness crisis. Folks, this is a letter. This is not from Van Hipp, and it's not from any other member of the vast right-wing conspiracy. This is a letter signed by the 7 members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff this year that went to our Senate Armed Services Committee. How did we get here? I think you got to go back to, I believe it was 2010, when the Obama administration in one of their first budgets submitted a defense budget that was $42 billion less than what our Joint Chiefs of Staff said we had to have. That same year, then Secretary Gates said he wanted to cancel $300 billion worth of additional programs. Last year, we saw $489 billion in cuts, 489 over a 10-year period, and now this year with the sequestration of $500 billion in additional cuts. That means during this administration, we've seen over $1.2 trillion in cuts to our national defense. Folks, we're no longer cutting fat. We are cutting muscle and we are cutting bone. The threat. I think the best illustration I can make right now to underscore the threat and that the impact that these cuts are having on our national security is the current situation in North Korea. I believe that this is the most significant nuclear threat the United States has faced since the Cold War, and probably the nearest term, most grave danger that this country faces. The ballistic missile capability of North Korea is real. We saw what happened in December with the Unha-3 rocket, getting that satellite achieving orbit. We went back and then looked at the debris in the Pacific, and we were able to estimate that the ballistic missile capability of North Korea today has a range of almost 6,200 miles. And how about this past month? The 5th nuclear bomb test by the North Koreans. Intelligence now tells us that it is the same miniaturized warhead design that the Iranians have, and you can trace it back to the infamous Dr. A.Q. Khan in Pakistan. We've also seen how the Iranians, for years, according to the Federation of American Scientists, and recently through a Chinese bank, have been sending money to North Korea to finance the missile development efforts. Yes, this is a very real threat. And intercontinental ballistic missile experts from Iran right now are working on the next North Korean test. President Bush understood the threat, and he deployed missile interceptors to Fort Greely, Alaska. The plan was for us to have 3 missile silo fields at Fort Greely. Last year, President Obama announced that Missile Field 1 would be decommissioned and further gutted defense and further cut back on missile interceptors, both ground-based interceptors and ship-based interceptors. Earlier this week on Monday, I wrote an op-ed for Fox News. We called on the administration to reconsider their decision and open Missile Field 1 back up and redeploy interceptors. This morning, as I was working on my remarks, I saw the ticker come across on Fox, and it said the Pentagon is announcing that Missile Field 1 is going to be opened back up, and they are going to deploy interceptors. Folks, this is a step in the right direction, but it should never have gotten to this point. This administration cut $1.4 billion from our Missile Defense Agency in its first 4 years and has announced another $3.6 billion in cuts over the next 4. These are tough times. These are serious times for America. Ronald Reagan understood what this president does not. That the reason you have a strong military is so that you never have to use it. He realized that the central role of any government is to provide for its people a strong national defense, and that all else is secondary. The Reagan policy of peace through strength was a good one. It served us well and will do so again. It is time for America to act, and it is time for America to lead. Thank you very much.
Well, there's a real hero. He actually kept to his time. Next is Mackenzie Eaglin, who's a fellow in foreign defense policy, American Enterprise Institute, and a former top official in the Department of Defense. Mackenzie?
Well, good morning. Thanks for having me. It's good to follow these two gentlemen. When I was invited to talk to CPAC last year, it was a much smaller panel than this room. I think the question was something along the lines that the panel started, or how much can we cut defense spending, military power, et cetera. And I thought, and I debated saying yes, and then I finally accepted the invite. And I thought, you know, at the LPAC, or whatever the liberal PAC equivalent is to our CPAC, I thought they're not going to have panels saying, how much more can we cut Medicare? I know that for sure. And I will channel my inner Ronald Reagan, not that you need it to hear it anymore, but to remind everyone that you're not going to find the same answer in this room on the question of our panel. You won't find it on the panel. That's what's so remarkable about conservatives right now, is that we don't have a clear answer. And when you don't have a clear answer, the President of the United States will run the table. And that's exactly what he's doing, particularly in terms of not just defense spending and defense bureaucracy, but in terms of American power. There's a reason we have credible military strength. It's to back up all of our soft power. It's to make our diplomacy work better and more effectively. It's to make our foreign aid more effective. It's to do a lot of other things. Our military is supposed to not fight the nation's wars. It's supposed to be credible enough so that you don't use it, as Van said. But we have a president who is dismantling military capacity and capability, and what he's doing is taking options off the table. We are restricting our foreign policy through our defense policy by dismantling the U.S. military. And that's okay if we all in this room got to agree to it and debate on it and sign up to it. But we're not talking about that to the American people. This is happening as part of budget wars and debates on the Hill that are about numbers. But it's not about America's role in the world. You're not hearing this larger debate. What should we be doing? Where should we be doing? What is this power and credible military strength supposed to be for now and in the future? It's clear to me what it's supposed to do. I know that I want my children to have the same benefits that I have had. Safety and security, I don't have to think about it. And why? Because peace and prosperity are inherently linked. There's a reason the two go together so well. Peace breeds prosperity, economic growth. It's the one thing you hear everybody talking about in Washington. Grow the economy, jobs, shrink government. All of the priorities that so many of us care about need an underpinning, an insurance policy. And for me, that insurance policy is national security, not having to fight long wars, not having to intervene because we were credible, we were there, we were forward, we were engaged overseas, and we were a part of the solution. We were influencing events before they became our problem that we have to pay a whole lot more to fix later. So that's what I want to see for the future. I want to channel my inner Ronald Reagan, and I want everyone else to do the same and remember why we have these capabilities. And eventually next year, when I come back to CPAC for my third time, I hope that we will have a unified panel and we'll have a discussion about how we are united on these issues and not divided so that the president doesn't get to decide for everybody and not make these decisions for us. Thank you.
Boy, 2 for 2. I'm really impressed. Senator Inhofe wanted me to say sorry he couldn't make it. He has Senate business today. He did come here yesterday, so he did his duty to come. But he said the guy who really knows about this subject is his guy on the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee. He'll speak next. Lucien Niemeyer.
I appreciate it, and I know you're all waiting for Governor Romney, so we'll make this as quick as possible. On the committee, for which I've been a member for 10 years, so one of the things that we really look at when we advise Senator Inhofe and other national security leaders is what are we need to be ready for. If you look at around the world right now, there's quite a wide range of challenges that are facing our country. If you look at the nut job in North Korea that's popping off nukes, you look at it ever increasingly aggressive China that's pouring more and more of its money into its military resources and threatening island neighbors and those of our allies in the region. You look at what's happening in Iran. You look at what that potentially threatens the existence of Israel. You look at 70,000 dying in Syria right now while this administration does nothing. You look at what's happening in North Sahara with the spread of al-Qaeda into Mali and other locations. You look to see what's happening down in South America with Chavez now luckily resting in peace. What might be happening in that part of the world? So it's really somewhat of a mystery to us on the committee, and we've been trying to fight this now for some time, that at a time when we're facing an incredibly wide range of threats to our national security, and those are the ones we only know on why this president would feel this is the time to cut over $1 trillion of defense budgets over the last 2 or 3 years. And some of the threats we don't even know about. I mean, probably the Director of National Intelligence just said the other day the greatest threat facing our country is actually cybersecurity, where some hacker with one keystroke can reverse polarity on the power grid and take down power for the entire eastern part of the country within a matter of seconds. So the range of these threats are unlike anything that we have seen as a country in a long time. And against that, we have a strategy which was developed last year and partially funded. It's not even fully funded. That doesn't even begin to provide the resources, military resources or otherwise, to be able to address these range of threats. And that's really what you have to look at when you're asking for what are our military forces ready for, what are they actually going to be called to do. We quite don't know. Right now, the requirements and the potential scenarios facing the military are wider than they've ever faced at any time. And really what it calls for is they need to be able to be ready for that full range of scenarios, and they're not right now. And that's something that we've been working with Senator Inhofe and others to try to bring attention that you can't really have a discussion about reducing defense budgets without understanding what the military strategy needs to be able to protect our interests around the world. That dialogue is not happening. In this day and age, we're trying to reduce overall federal discretionary spending. The key is, the word is just cut defense. Keep cutting defense, keep going deeper, find those savings, find those efficiencies. But at some point, those cutting of resources equates to increased risk, risk to the lives of our men and women in the military. That's a very, very difficult decision to make, one that we're going to continue to work on in the committee to try to make sure the American people understand that when we keep cutting defense budgets, we're having a real impact on a segment of our society that continues to sacrifice on behalf of our country. And that's something I just would like to be able to talk more during the panel. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, whoever picked this panel really was great. And everyone's keeping on time, too. Our final speaker, an old friend of mine, actually was a lieutenant in the Navy surface warfare mission that he may tell you something about. He's the senior defense analyst at the Cato Institute. Chris Preble.
Thanks, Don, and great to be here. Thanks to CPAC for having this panel. Americans want a strong military, and the good news is they have one. The finest military in the world, bar none. But sometimes spending too much money on a good thing can be a problem, and conservatives understand that, I think, better than most. The leading opponents of spending cuts are fans of big, open-ended nation-building missions around the world. Most Americans are determined to avoid these kinds of missions. But as conservatives should be especially wary of such missions. After all, a government that's incapable of feeding the hungry, clothing and housing the homeless in this country can't possibly do that 8,000 miles away. Likewise, U.S. troops should not be the first responders of every single 911 call that comes down. Other countries must step forward to take responsibility for their own defense. And this is also a conservative value, self-reliance and responsibility among all the nations. Now, first some context, because you've heard some assertions so far. Total military spending in real inflation-adjusted dollars remains high by historic standards. Indeed, from 2011 to 2012, total national security spending increased by $11 billion. And even under sequestration, the scary sequester, average spending on the base Pentagon budget in the next decade will be $542 billion. That is more than we spent on average during the Cold War. More to the point, spending is not the best measure of military effectiveness. And again, conservatives should know this. Some still do. Quote, "Spending is not caring," explained Americans for Tax Reform President Grover Norquist in a recent interview with the American Conservative magazine. Spending is what politicians do instead of caring. It's hardly surprising that leaders of defense contractors, the businesses who profit from taxpayer money, want more of it. I understand that, but it doesn't explain to me why conservatives especially should be so eager to oblige. Conservatives understand, after all, the key to turning around the American economy is to free up resources for the private sector, cut taxes, shrink the size of government. It simply doesn't make sense for conservatives who wisely oppose most forms of federal spending to favor the military kind. Now, some conservatives countered that defense is a core function of government and therefore should not be treated on an equal footing with the federal spending on education or agriculture or Obamacare. This is true. I concede that. The Constitution clearly stipulates a federal role for defense, but our founding document contains no mention of common learning standards for grade schoolers, guaranteed prices for a bushel of wheat for farmers, or motorized wheelchairs for senior citizens. It's not in the document. But neither is there anything in the document that says the United States of America is responsible for defending other countries who can defend themselves. It's not in there. Nowhere will you find it written that Americans must provide security for others. That is the job for their governments, not ours. Conservatives who rail appropriately against welfare state dependency, we have a culture of dependency in this country, should appreciate that U.S. tax dollars have created an entire class of dependent countries around the world. And these governments, who should have been attending to their own country's defense, have chosen instead to invest additional resources in their welfare states. Now, a military focused on defending this country, core U.S. national security, could be smaller and far less expensive. And a number of conservatives have taken the lead in this effort, proposing cuts. I won't mention them all. One start is to audit the Pentagon. Senators Rand Paul and Tom Coburn want to do that. Congressman Mick Mulvaney from South Carolina successfully championed an effort last year in the House to freeze Pentagon spending for 1 year. That's right, I said freeze Pentagon spending for 1 year. Representative Mike Kaufman from Colorado, a member of the Armed Services Committee, has put forward a number of concrete recommendations. Kaufman's a Marine Corps combat veteran. A number of good ideas there. The point is there are many conservatives who do understand this. Finally, Don mentioned Senator Coburn's report, the Department of Everything. Any of you who doubt that the United States military would remain the strongest in the world, but we can't cut a single penny from the Pentagon, you should read that report. Let me close it with this. Look, Americans overwhelmingly support our troops, but they appreciate that not every dollar that's spent on the military is spent wisely, and conservatives, especially conservatives, should appreciate that an effective defense need not be an expensive defense, and certainly not as expensive as the military that defeated the Soviet Union. By restructuring our military to address its most solemn obligation, defending the United States, we can keep faith with our troops and reduce the burden on American taxpayers. Thank you.
Thank you. And believe it or not, and I didn't think we'd have any time, we do have some time for the panelists to talk to each other. I'll first throw it open to anyone on the panel. Would they like to comment on anything any of the other speakers said? Chris, you laid the challenge. How would you lay the challenge in one sentence to a question to your panelists here about defense?
I think I agree with Mackenzie and Lucian and Van that we should be talking about the mission of the military, and I tried to lay out very clearly where I think our military's missions are too broad, that we are doing too much. We are asking our military to do too much, and we are asking too little of other countries that can defend themselves. So I would like to have that conversation.
And I agree. And you know, I'm an old Reagan conservative, and I agree. The real test of when you commit U.S. forces is the vital national security interest of the United States at stake. I like the idea of the audit in the Pentagon. There are some great things we can do, but I got to tell you, look what's happening. Like I get back to North Korea. This decision that we've just reversed today is going to cost us money. It would have cost us less money if we had made the right decision before and had an adequate missile defense capability for this country.
Mackenzie?
If I had a guarantee for Dr. Preble's outcome with Lucian's prescription, then I would take it, because any smart American who cares about the future of the country would take that. But let's talk about what is actually happening, because there's a right way and a wrong way to start cutting defense budgets, and we're $1 trillion deep now before the sequester. Okay, so let's not even talk about sequestration. We all hate the word anyway. Before the sequester, we're at $1 trillion in U.S. military cuts, even though every other federal agency has been proposed to receive generous net increases and taxpayers have been asked to pay more. Only the U.S. military has been targeted for debt reduction, but there's still stimulus spending in the president's budget, so it's not really going to debt reduction, and that's the funny shell game on the American people. So $1 trillion taken out of the defense budget. If I could get what Chris says, I would take it, because I am a good conservative, and I want fiscal sanity as well. The problem is the way that President Obama is dismantling the U.S. military is he's removing capacity and capability. He's not going after the structural drivers of defense spending that are the real problem. The audit is great. Everybody agrees every federal agency should be audited. But this year, the president proposed, for example, laying off 100,000 active duty soldiers and Marines, active duty, after 11 years of pretty busy combat operations overseas. The 800,000 large DoD civilian workforce, not one person was laid off under President Obama or proposed to be cut or reduced in any way. These are not the priorities I want to see when we're cutting defense. There's a right way and a wrong way. If you're going to go after the bureaucracy, and you're going to go after the infrastructure and the overhead, go for it.
Lucen. Thank you.
Chris, I do have one question for you, and this really gets down to the heart of where we need to go, not just as a nation, but also as a party, is whether you believe in the concept of American exceptionalism, the concept that's so emboldened by President Reagan about being the house on the hill for which the entire world looked to for leadership and looked to for protection and for an opportunity to be free. If you do believe in American exceptionalism, that requires an investment, and it requires an investment, and it requires a commitment to our allies and to those around the world to maintain that positive relationship. And I just want to pose that question to you.
I absolutely do believe in American exceptionalism, and I think that what made this country so exceptional and what President Reagan was invoking, the notion of the city on the hill, was that we were a model to be emulated. We were a model that other countries should fashion themselves after. And when we attended to our business at home, when we maintained fiscal sanity, when we defended our interests when they were challenged and worked with others when our common interests were challenged, that's all fully consistent. But Americans today are spending between 2.5 and 7 times what our allies are spending on defense on a per capita basis. And the reason is very simple. I don't blame my allies. If I was promising to pay for something that you need, why would you pay for it? It makes perfect sense. And I think that made sense after the end of World War II when these countries were broken and broke. But I think we missed an opportunity, several actually, to call on these countries to do more to defend themselves. And we continue to discourage them from doing so to this day.
Mackenzie?
Okay, hang on.
Go ahead.
So then you would agree then when President Reagan took office in 1980, other than threatening the Iranians to turn into glass, and that's how we got the hostages back, you do believe that the commitment in funding, the increase in funding, ultimately, not just for our own military, but for our allies, really helped to bring down the Soviet Union, right, in 1989?
I think the Soviet Union was headed to the ash heap of history. After all, we believe in conservative values. Communism's not going to work, but I think he probably hastened it, and I'm happy for that. I fought, as you know, Lucien, I served in the military to defeat the Soviet Union. My argument is, right now, we're spending today, right now, more in inflation-adjusted dollars than Ronald Reagan did in his 8 years in office. So it seems to me that if it was good enough if $540 billion was good enough back then, it's certainly good enough now.
Mackenzie, then Van.
I don't want to compare apples to oranges to our audience. So, and not that anyone is doing that, but when I talk about what we need our military strength, credibility, and power to do in the world, it doesn't matter to me what it is relative to everyone else, because what's most important is American exceptionalism and American leadership. We have the strongest military in the world that costs the most because we do things that no one else does. We have a global military because they have global reach and global responsibilities. And part of the benefit, we all benefit from that. Everyone in this room benefits from that. It's unfortunate that there's freeloading and free riding on the system. I totally agree, and if there was a way to audit that, I certainly would. But we don't keep the world's global shipping lanes open for anyone but ourselves in our $14 trillion economy, so that you and I can go to Walmart or Target or the grocery store and have price competition, to have the free flow of goods and services. So you can check your iPhone right now while we're talking, probably, and get on the internet, because we protect the sea lines of communication that allow you access to cyber, that allow you to use your GPS to get here if you drove to CPAC today. All of these things, we do them for ourselves. It's nice that other people, I guess, get the benefit of that, but it's not for them. It just so happens that they get to have some of that, but it's really for us, and we need to remember why we're doing it.
Van?
Defense today, defense spending as a percentage of the GDP is 4 to 5% of GDP today. It was 6 to 7% during the Cold War. Our Pentagon folks tell us that even with the cuts, we can no longer fight two military regional conflicts simultaneously, which historically has been the policy of the United States. We're down to one. And I believe with the $1.2 trillion in cuts, we got a darn tough time being able to fight one successfully. And let's not forget why this country came together. The states came together. Go back and look at history and look at the Constitution. Priority number one of the federal government, to provide for the common defense of the American people.
All right, thank you. We're going to have to come to an end. I think the panel was great. And I think first of all, in this panel, I see realism. We're going to differ on, but that's the important thing. We got to be realistic about this and not do knee-jerk ideology and just throw money and get involved in everything in the world. Second thing is, I'll say as an old personnel manager, anyone who says in the sequester that he can't send out an American carrier to a responsibility in the field should be fired on the spot, including his boss. Thank you.
Some nights I call it a draw. Some nights